So we will be spending a few days talking about the forces of history in divine perspective. I think what I want to try to do, rather than this is going to be very philosophical, there's going to be a lot of abstract ideas, but what I really wanted to do was ground it in the present day realities and to present what I'm going to offer to you as a way out of the crisis of the present day. And today, on day one, we're going to be focusing on this crisis that the world is facing, which is a crisis in many different dimensions. I don't need to summarize it for you. All it takes is a look at the headlines to see the war, the pandemic, the deepening polarization of our politics, all of this triggering a financial recession, and hovering over this, a great climate catastrophe, which is really unfolding in slow motion before our eyes, and which requires a kind of solution that the planet seems at present incapable of providing, because it requires a degree of coordination among nations and peoples that has not been possible until now. And that is the framework for my comments, which can be seen as a way of suggesting how we might bridge certain otherwise unbridgeable, heretofore unbridgeable differences that have divided humanity. Differences primarily of religion, nationality, race, and other lines, but also a divide that has opened up between science and religion, between seeing the world rationally and seeing the world, let's say, through a more intuitive lens. So what I'll be talking about will be an attempt to provide fresh perspective. There are a lot of perspectives out there. Why invest so much time listening to someone providing one more perspective? Why should we care? And how can we evaluate the success of any perspective? Because one of the things that we realize just from any observation and attempt to model the universe, scientifically, or to understand any sequence of events, one can take the information, take the data that is available to you, and come up with a lot of different theories which can fit those facts. In other words, the number of theories, the number of perspectives, the number of ways of making sense there's always more than one way of trying to make sense of things, which is consistent with the facts that we have, which presents a problem when we're trying to forge a way forward. Because, and I'm sorry, I guess we're running ahead of myself a little bit, if we don't have access to the ground truth of things, if all we have are observations, if all we have are models of reality, then how do you differentiate one set of ideas from another? I'm going to be presenting in the next few days a set of ideas, a set of perspectives that are hopefully coherent, that hopefully make sense, that are hopefully consistent with the known facts of the world. But what if there are multiple ways of doing that? And this is one of the great sort of conundrums to resolve. And I'll suggest a very pragmatic criterion, which is ultimately the litmus test of any new perspective is it useful? Does it help? Is it a remedy to a particular problem? And as we'll see, this is how Baha'u'llah describes his own revelation. When he uses the imagery of the divine physician, he says, who has his finger on the pulse of humanity, who perceives the illness and prescribes in his infallible wisdom the cure, and that this remedy is different from age to age. Baha'u'llah is suggesting to us, I think, a very pragmatic criterion. He's saying, look at what I've brought, look at these teachings, look at these ideas as a solution to a particular set of problems. And the set of problems of the problem of the age that Baha'u'llah has identified is the problem of disunity. And so he's providing tools to bring humanity together. Now, we would expect that these tools, this remedy for the problem of the age, ought to correlate to reality, whatever that deep level of reality is, but we don't have access to that deep level of reality. All we have access to is, does this thing work or not? You know, if you apply these ideas, will it bring about a healing of the divides, or won't it? So today, we're going to be looking at providing a context for this fresh perspective that I'll attempt to pull together the pieces of over the next few days. And really the starting point of this, I'll start with Einstein, why not? Because he stated really that a fresh perspective is needed. You know, we can't solve the problems of the present with the same kind of thinking that got us into it. We have to somehow break out of old ways of thinking. And it's very tempting to stay in those old ways of thinking when they're comfortable, when they provide clear answers, when they distinguish black from white with great precision. But what if the truth of things is messier than that? What if the real solution requires something beyond black and white thinking? What if the solution that Baha'u'llah is offering requires us to be comfortable with tension, to be comfortable with ambiguity, to be comfortable with diversity? And as we'll be talking about in the next few days, this fresh perspective that we will suggest is a way of being comfortable with diversity. Because in reality, it is not going to be possible to impose unity, the total unity of thought, total unity of belief. And we wouldn't want to if we could, because the diversity of human thought and belief is what gives us such strength. The problem is we human beings have not figured out yet how to come together and act coherently and in unity with deep differences of thought and belief. And this is the great, I believe this is the great insight that Baha'u'llah has given us. So we're going to be looking for new solutions. Baha'u'llah has promised us that what he's brought us is brand new. This is something that has never been seen before. He said, there hath appeared what hath never previously appeared. Even though it's clothed in language that may seem quite familiar, which we might think we know what these words mean. You know, Baha'u'llah is using the same words with the same, you can look in the dictionary and find the definitions of these words Baha'u'llah uses when he says God, or when he says religion, or when he says spirit, or when he says manifestation. These different words, we think we know what they mean, but as we'll see, they've been subtly and sometimes profoundly redefined in the Baha'i writings. So, we're going to start by trying to figure out how we got to where we are, and there's really two ways of thinking about it. You could either say, you know, the world is a really big mess in all sorts of ways, everything's falling apart. We have I will share some wonderful statements and scary statements from the Baha'i writings that explain this, but also, you could also take the other viewpoint that things have never been better. Steven Pinker, a professor at Harvard, is an example of someone who kind of, in the face of conventional wisdom that everything is falling apart looks at the data and says, well, let's look at average lifespans, let's look at levels of education, let's look at all of these quantifiable measures of human well-being over the last few centuries. And his argument is things have actually never been better. And so who's right? Are we living in an age of light and with everything on the ascending arc? Or are we living in this age of darkness and we're teetering on the brink of an abyss and everything is about to fall apart? Or is it the case that we're talking about twin processes of integration and disintegration, which is the title of my presentations over these next few days? And if both are true in a way, then how can we talk about these processes of integration and disintegration that sort of makes sense of it all? So, because I can't read my screen, I'm going to be looking behind me a bit, I guess, for these quotations. I'll try to find a more elegant way of doing this tomorrow. But, as we're familiar with the writings of Baha'u'llah, who has said in one of his tablets, "The world is in travail, and its agitation waxeth day by day. Its face is turned towards waywardness and unbelief. Such shall be its plight that to disclose it now would not be meet and seemly. Its perversity will long continue, and when the appointed hour is come, thou shalt suddenly appear, that which shall cause the limbs of mankind to quake. Then and only then will the divine standard be unfurled, and the nightingale of paradise to warble its melody." And Abdu'l-Baha says, "Chaos and confusion are daily increasing in the world. They will attain such intensity as to render the frame of mankind unable to bear them. Then will men be awakened and become aware that religion is the impregnable stronghold and the manifest light of the world, and its laws, exhortations, and teachings the source of life on earth." Have the translators managed to pull up these quotes? Are you doing fine in the back? I see it now, thank you. And from Shoghi Effendi, he says, "Adversity prolonged, worldwide, afflictive, allied to chaos and universal destruction, must needs convulse the nations, stir the conscience of the world, disillusion the masses, precipitate a radical change in the very conception of society, and coalesce ultimately the disjointed, the bleeding limbs of mankind into one body, single, organically united, and indivisible." But against these very dire predictions and prognostications about the state of the present, we have the opposite being said at the same time by Abdu'l-Baha. He says, "In cycles gone by, though harmony was established, yet owing to the absence of means, the unity of all mankind could not have been achieved. In this day, however, means of communication have multiplied, and the 5 continents of the earth have virtually merged into one. For none is self-sufficiency any longer possible, inasmuch as political ties unite all peoples and nations, and the bonds of trade and industry, of agriculture and education are being strengthened every day. Hence, the unity of all mankind can in this day be achieved. Verily, this is none other but one of the wonders of this wondrous age, this glorious century. Of this, past ages have been deprived, for this century, the century of light, hath been endowed with unique and unprecedented glory, power, and illumination." So we have both an idea that there's certainly a suspicion that there may be twin processes going on here. And to understand how we got to this strange sort of position where things seem to be falling apart in one way but building up in another way. I think it would be useful to go back in time briefly, just a few hundred years, which in historical time is really the blink of an eye if we're looking at human civilization, to identify what I think is one of the great turning points in civilization, sparked on the Western continent, but very rapidly spread. Rapidly spread in some parts and slowly in others throughout the world. And this is the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment that was sparked subsequent to the scientific revolution. And I highlight this moment in history, this turning point in human history, as somehow a key to understanding where we are now, and also a key to understanding how we can get to the next stage. Because it was through this fairly rapid historical moment in the 1600s, early 1700s, that there was suddenly a shift in thinking that had the effect of drastically undermining the framework of traditional values and thinking that had up until that time been the unquestioned assumption of people throughout history, really, but particularly if we're thinking of throughout Western civilization. This is the assumption that ultimately the world is governed by God actively, that the authorities of the past had figured everything out, and that not just in matters of religion, people would turn to the scriptures, the ancient scriptures, for the answers of everything. People would also turn to the ancient texts of the Greeks in medicine and in astronomy. People would turn to the succession of kings who claimed to rule by divine right. The world was filled with authorities who were unquestioned. Authorities which often were of very ancient origin. And the cracks in this way of thinking really began to appear with the scientific revolution. And I think that's probably a good enough starting point for our purposes, is the astronomical observations of Copernicus and Galileo that cracked the crystalline sphere of the heavens wide open. For the first time, there was an intimation that how we thought about the universe, static, fixed, immovable, everything moving in perfect circles and spheres, as correctly described by the ancient Greeks. This vision of the universe was cracked open by the invention of the telescope and the observations of the moons of Jupiter and the planets, which made us realize for the first time that maybe these ancient authorities did not have it all figured out. Maybe there are other and better ways of describing the world around us that don't simply appeal to some past authority who said it's this way and therefore that's what we believe. So this revolution, which really we can say it began with the observation of the heavens, spread rapidly. It was found that there are actually mathematical models to describe the universe that work better than the assertions of certain Greek philosophers like Aristotle. That there were models that could predict very precisely the movement of objects, of course the movement of planets in their orbits, but also the movement of things down here on Earth. And this sparked really an incredible revolution in human thought. Maybe human reason the application of human reason and collecting of data, collecting of information, and developing theories on the basis of that data, testing those theories against the data, and then revising the theories as necessary. In other words, the scientific method. Maybe this scientific method can be applied to everything. And maybe that allows us to disregard or overturn all of these authorities of the past. So the scientific method, which first began to be applied in matters of astronomy and physical things on the Earth, started to be applied to successively more and more abstract things. Maybe kings don't rule by divine right. Maybe there's a better way to think about how we can organize ourselves. Maybe ancient scriptures, religious scriptures, don't tell us exactly the way the heavens go. Maybe we can figure that out on our own. This Enlightenment that was sparked, this intellectual movement sparked in the West by the scientific revolution, is dated around late 1600s to early 1700s, and it was followed by other counter movements and further movements, which we don't really need to get into, because the idea of the Enlightenment, the idea that we can question authority, that reason, the application of reason and scientific method is our best way of getting at truth. The idea that the individual should be free to investigate that truth. These ideas that have their origin in the Enlightenment are still very much alive and with us today, and caused a great unraveling of the order of the universe that had maintained society, that had kept people on a certain path of virtue, on a path of religiously inspired virtue, because of the institutions of religion that had been the undergirding framework of Western civilization. This framework was greatly weakened, if not entirely pulled out from underneath Western civilization. And one way of summarizing the last few centuries of Western civilization following the Enlightenment has been a kind of slow motion collapse of these old ways of thinking, which has very much accelerated in recent years, even in our lifetime. I'll say very briefly, this is how Immanuel Kant in the 1700s defined enlightenment. You may recognize something of this in the Baha'i writings. He said, "What is enlightenment? Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Dare to know. Have courage to use your own understanding." That is the motto of enlightenment. But also enlightenment for Kant was an idea that humanity, previously in a phase of childhood, was now passing into maturity. That human civilization perhaps was going through an adolescent period, and that this sort of awakening enlightenment was corresponded to the adolescence of the human race. We find the Baha'i writing saying the same thing, that humanity is passing through this period of turbulent adolescence on its way to maturity. So this slow motion collapse of old ways of thinking came about in part because we discovered that the universe is simply too big, it's too old for our ancient sacred narratives to fit in. The narrative of Adam and Eve and the tree is just too small of a narrative for a universe which now extends outwards to billions of planets and galaxies and backwards to at least 13 or 14 billion years. It forced us to reassess some of these underpinning narratives that we had really never questioned. We had never questioned that the earth and humanity was the center of the universe. You know, we are God's creation, so of course we're at the center of everything. You know, we're the purpose of it all. We're the be-all, end-all. But suddenly, hold on, the earth is just a planet going around a sun, and the sun is 1,000 times bigger than the earth. Try to imagine what a shock that was. The displacement of humanity from what was assumed to be the center, and now, oh, the sun is the center. But okay, that was a shock, but maybe, you know, some ancient Greeks had that idea, so it wasn't a totally outrageous, outlandish idea. But now the idea that the sun and all its planets is orbiting around a galaxy, I mean, what an even bigger shock. I mean, that completely displaces us from something which maybe approximated the center to now something which is so far away from the center. We're just in some neglected neighborhood of of the galaxy. But then, it's not just, you know, that we're at the edge of a galaxy filled with, you know, hundreds of millions of stars. There are hundreds of billions of other galaxies scattered throughout a universe in which the galaxies becomes insignificant. Each galaxy becomes as insignificant as a speck of dust. When one trains our most powerful telescopes out into the universe, one finds nothing but fields of galaxies everywhere. How can our way of thinking about the universe, these old ways of thinking about the universe, survive the facts of the universe which are there every time you just look outside into the night sky with a telescope and see just how big it all is? So clearly new ways of thinking are called for. The sociologist Peter Berger, a very well-known figure in the sociology of religion, who actually did his early work in the mid-20th century on the Baha'i faith, has made I think a penetrating insight into this slow motion destruction of old ways of thinking that has, as a result of the Enlightenment. And I think it's it's a powerful enough thought to take a little bit of time to read it, because it helps situate where we are in a non-dichotomous way. It's not just that, oh, this Enlightenment happened a few hundred years ago and sort of all of civilization shifted and now, you know, it's never that black and white. And he describes it quite well in this quotation. He says, "Historical crises are rarely consummated in one dramatic moment. They're contained in processes that extend over periods of time and that are experienced in different ways by those affected. As Nietzsche tells us in the famous passage about the death of God, this tremendous event is still on its way. It would therefore be extraordinarily naive to expect the demise of the supernatural to be equally visible from all vantage points of our culture, or to be experienced in the same way by all who have taken cognizance of it. There continues to be religious and theological milieu in which the crisis is, at its most, dimly sensed as an external threat in the distance. In other milieu, the crisis is beginning to be felt, but is still on its way. In yet other milieu, the crisis is in full eruption as a deep threat inside the fabric of religious practice, faith, and thought. And in some places, it is as if the believer or theologian were standing in a landscape of smoldering ruins." And this landscape of smoldering ruins is perhaps best describes the sort of the intellectual corners of the West, where the supernatural has been fully evicted from the stage, and in which there's nothing left but as the cold picture of the universe, by and large, a vast void, populated by some atoms, and it's really just atoms and the void that describes everything. That there is no objective truth or grounding, that really it's all just stories all the way down. And different groups jockeying for power to see whose story or whose narrative wins the day. In the eyes of the sort of modern or really postmodern imagination, we are all on a raft at sea with no solid ground beneath our feet, all adrift, perhaps on different rafts, each sort of battling for dominance. But the emptiness, however, of this materialistic paradigm, which is where we're left now in this landscape of smoking ruins here in the West. And I just wanted to also mention that Peter Berger's insight, I think, is so valuable because not all parts of the world have experienced the full force of this deconstruction of the supernatural equally. In Baha'u'llah's time, in Persia of the mid-19th century, the ideals of the Enlightenment had barely begun to penetrate. This was still a civilization which was fully under the sway of traditional ways of thinking. I think it's part of the miracle of Baha'u'llah's writings and the miracle of the Baha'i faith that despite coming from this culture, a very long and distinguished culture with an amazing tradition of art and poetry and so forth, but still very much untouched by the Enlightenment, by the ideals of reason, and by the deconstruction of superstition. That Baha'u'llah could have come to such a country and yet have said such things that catapult humanity into a different place entirely. A place that is on the other side of the Enlightenment, a place that enables us to fully embrace what has been achieved through this seemingly destructive process, and to realize that on the other side of it lies a reawakening of the spirit and a redefinition of religion, a redefinition of the meaning and purpose behind human life that is continuous with this great cataclysmic upheaval of the Enlightenment and doesn't represent a turning back of the clock. More on that in a few minutes. The kind of this emptiness of a life without God, a life just populated by atoms in the void, in which there is no greater meaning, has been brilliantly skewered by a couple of people, one of which is Abdu'l-Baha. Abdu'l-Baha loved to talk about the cow when he was in front of Western audiences, needling a little bit the idea that the scientific mindset is the highest and best way of approaching the world. Of course, Abdu'l-Baha was very much pro-science, was very much pro-reason, but at the same time, he wanted to remind us that science and reason were only part of the solution. In one of his talks, he says, like the philosophers, the cow is a captive of nature and knows nothing beyond the range of the senses. The philosophers, however, glory in this, saying, we are not captives of superstitions. We have implicit faith in the impressions of the senses and know nothing beyond the realm of nature, which contains and covers everything. But the cow, without study or proficiency in the sciences, modestly and quietly views life from the same standpoint, living in harmony with nature's laws in the utmost dignity and nobility. Another skewering of this mindset has been given by Alan Watts. I don't know how many people are familiar with Alan Watts, but he was a great intellectual who was instrumental in bringing some of the wisdom of the mystic East to the West in the 1960s. He also had a great sort of insight about what is left in this Peter Berger's landscape of smoldering ruins. Once you remove all the meaning, once you remove this framework of understanding of God and the supernatural from the universe, then all that is left is just, well, what are we then? Alan Watts says basically, well, we're just tubes then. We're tubes that just take in food at one end and let it out at the other. That's kind of all you're left with. So here's how he describes it. He says, there's a growing apprehension that existence is a rat race and a trap. Living organisms, including people, are merely tubes which put things in at one end and let them out at the other, which both keeps them doing it and in the long run wears them out. So, to keep the farce going, the tubes find ways of making new tubes, which also put things in at one end and let them out at the other. At the input end, they even develop ganglia of nerves called brains, with eyes and ears so that they can more easily scrounge around for things to swallow. As and when they get enough to eat, they use up their surplus energy by wiggling in complicated patterns, making all sorts of noises by blowing air in and out of the input hole, and gathering together in groups to fight with other groups. There's a vague rule not to eat tubes of your own form, but in general, there's serious competition as to who is going to be the top type of tube. So that's really, you could try to dress it up, with as much as you like, but I think he could accurately put his finger on sort of what's left if there's no meaning. And this is really all that's left. It's a competition for existence. It's, well, eat, drink and be merry, basically. So, so on to this scene of emptiness, which of course has been proceeding at a different pace in different parts of the world. Here in the West, it's the destruction is most complete. But onto this scene of crisis of meaning, Baha'u'llah comes. Baha'u'llah, the divine physician who diagnoses this crisis of meaning and gives us a remedy for it. It's, I think, important for us to realize that Baha'u'llah's message and the message that his son Abdul Baha gave in subsequent years in his visits in the West represent the first post-Enlightenment, post-modern instance of this religious impulse to come into the world. All of the other religions historically came about far before the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment. And so the Baha'i writings implicitly take this, are engaging with this problem of the loss of meaning experienced in the West. Baha'u'llah diagnoses this sort of defectiveness of the present order. He says, the winds of despair are alas blowing from every direction, and the strife that divideth and afflicteth the human races, daily increasing. The signs of impending convulsions and chaos can now be discerned, inasmuch as the prevailing order appeareth to be lamentably defective. What is it about the prevailing order that is lamentably defective? And this is a key question that I want to ask, and I'll offer my own answer to it, and you'll have a chance to discuss this in groups in the seminars following this talk. But the key question is, when Baha'u'llah says the prevailing order is lamentably defective, is he referring to the Enlightenment project? Is Baha'u'llah critiquing the Enlightenment itself? Is he saying this order which has resulted from this new age of reason that has led to the decline and collapse of religious structures? Is Baha'u'llah In other words, asking for us to roll back the Enlightenment. As he's saying, this was some wrong turn in human history. It's led to this great defect in the prevailing order. We need to find that we recognize that we've taken this wrong turn away from God into godlessness, into materialism, into scientism, into these very physical pursuits, all sparked by this, godless movement. Is that what Baha'u'llah is suggesting? Or is Baha'u'llah suggesting something else? Is Baha'u'llah, when he critiques the defectiveness of the order, the present world order, is he critiquing the materialism of the day? Is he critiquing the taking of civilization, which itself is a good thing, all the great things that civilization brings, but taking to the extremes of everything, extremes of personal freedom, which lead to a dissolution of the bonds of society, extremes of material comfort, which, what's wrong with comfort? But if you live your entire life in total comfort, never encountering anything that could provoke the least discomfort, how can you grow without some discomfort? Is Baha'u'llah critiquing the extremes of things? And if so, is it like, if you critique science because some scientists are materialists, isn't that the same as critiquing religion because some religious followers are fanatics? So if Baha'u'llah's critique of the existing order is the excesses of materialism and the sort of overweening sense of personal freedom, can this be done while at the same time embracing in the main the principles and of the Enlightenment itself? And this is the question I'm asking, and the argument I'll be making is that the Baha'i teachings are very much embracing these values from the age of reason and accepting all of the consequences that ensue, including what Nietzsche called the death of God. But the death of God that Nietzsche is declaring is the death of some superstitious notion that the Baha'i writings themselves say was long past due anyway. So you can look at this in two different ways. You can say, well, this age of reason came and then suddenly the churches have emptied and the synagogues are abandoned and everyone is turning away from God. Or you can look at the same process and say, we discovered reason and we let go of superstition. So two ways of thinking about this. So is it the case, though, that the Baha'i writings embrace the main ideals of the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason? I argue that it doesn't. Here's just a few examples. First of all, the embrace of reason itself, the investigation of reality, the celebration of the fruits of the intellect. In the opening pages, I'll come back to this in a moment, in the opening pages of The Secret of Divine Civilization, with apologies to the translator because I added this at the last minute, so you might not have this on hand and finish. But Abdu'l-Baha writes in the opening paragraphs of his great essay on what divine civilization is and how to bring it into being, he's praising the mind, the power of the mind and the intellect. He says, praise and thanksgiving be unto providence that of all the realities in existence he has chosen the reality of man and has honored it with intellect and wisdom, the two most luminous lights in either world. Through the agency of this most great endowment he has in every epoch cast on the mirror of creation new and wonderful configurations. If we look objectively upon the world of being, it will become apparent that from age to age, the temple of existence has continually been embellished with a fresh grace and distinguished with an ever-varying splendor deriving from wisdom and the power of thought. this supreme emblem of God stands first in the order of creation and first in rank, taking precedence over all created things. Witness to it is the holy tradition. Before all else, God created the mind. From the dawn of creation, it was made to be revealed in the temple of man. I mean, what an incredible sort of praise of mind and power of thought. Very much, I think, in line with what you might call, the fundamental principle of the Enlightenment, which is this great power of reason and the mind to solve problems. But other Enlightenment values, which are found very, very much affirmed in the Baha'i writings, freedom of thought and belief also very much is aligned with the principle of the investigation of reality. Embrace of progress, the idea that through the explorations of the mind, the development of more and more powerful ways of controlling our environment, of understanding nature, that human civilization progresses. Baha'u'llah said, all men are created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. The Baha'i faith, I believe, is really it's the only one of the world's religious traditions that I'm aware of that explicitly has progress sort of embedded into it. Progressive revelation, the idea that religion itself is constantly in a state of evolution, that the next iteration is going to be a fuller expression than the iteration that came before, puts Baha'u'llah's revelation, I think, on a different footing, because it puts the truth and our encounter with the truth into the future, whereas all of the other faith traditions are looking into the past. They're all looking into the closest encounter with the truth being when their prophet revealed their book. And for Baha'is, although there's a great veneration, of course, of Baha'u'llah's writings, there's also an understanding that we are constantly progressing and evolving, and that our closest encounter with the truth still lies ahead of us, that there will still be more to come. And this idea of progress is also a great ideal of the Enlightenment. The suspicion of received authorities, this is one of the, as I discussed before, one of the sort of great, powerful deconstructing forces of the Enlightenment was that every human institution was successfully examined with this cold light of reason, and in most cases completely changed or overthrown. In the case of the Baha'i teachings, the focus really is on the received authority of the clergy, and the recognition that it's been often the clergy and the unquestioned authority that they carried, which has been responsible for age to age of the people not recognizing new infusions of the religious impulse when it comes into the world. And finally, also very important, that, and this is affirmed by Abdu'l-Baha in the first chapter of Some Answered Questions, and elsewhere in the Baha'i writings, that there's a chain of causes and effects expressible through unchanging laws, expressed through the language of mathematics that bind together all phenomena. Abdu'l-Baha in Some Answered Questions said, this universal law admits of no exceptions. It is that which underlies all the phenomena of the physical universe, very much in line with the scientific picture of the world. So I'm emphasizing this point, and I feel it's an important point to emphasize, because we can go in sort of two directions when we imagine what kind of solutions the Baha'i faith offers to the world. And we might go in two different directions if our starting point is that the Enlightenment was in some way a wrong turn, that in some way the dissolution of religious institutions that has happened over the last few centuries has represented a wrong turn historically, a turning away from God, whereas one could take a different position which sees this dissolution of religion as really a dissolution of the superstition that had long taken the place of religion. And in that sense, the Enlightenment represents a great leap forward for the human race, not just intellectually, but spiritually, because it allowed us to reach that next level of human consciousness. It allowed human consciousness to further advance. And as the House of Justice said, Baha'u'llah didn't come to bring one more religion into the world, to battle against all the other existing religions, but rather has Baha'u'llah come to recast the very conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. And what has impelled the development of consciousness more than this great birth of reason that happened a few centuries ago on the European continent? So, let's see how much time we have left. It's 10:26. How much time do we have?
But I mean, since we have to end at some point at 12.
Yeah. Okay.
Then leaving enough time for the seminar.
Okay. Okay. We'll keep going a bit. I have a little bit more to cover. And then we'll talk about what we'll do in the seminars. Okay, so I'm arguing that Baha'u'llah's revelation is aligned with the Age of Reason and Enlightenment values, that it embraces the idea that scientific insights can tell us something about the world. We're going to spend most of tomorrow actually talking about aspects of the scientific picture of the world, some of the deep structures of reality, some of the great insights about how things work that have come to us mainly from science, that also tell us something about the spiritual world. But also what we're going to end up doing is kind of deconstructing the whole idea in our minds that maybe the physical and spiritual worlds are these sort of two separate realms, maybe somehow connected in some way we might not understand, but that they're made of different kinds of substances, each doing their own thing. We'll be examining that and hopefully by the end deconstructing that a bit. So Baha'u'llah then comes onto the scene in this sort of amidst these the ruins of or the accelerating destruction of religion, and he gives us solutions that embody a new conceptual framework. As he says, this thing has never appeared before. It can easily be misconstrued as more of the same. You can easily read Baha'u'llah's words and say, this sounds just like the Quran, or this sounds like, name your religious, your religious book. And so, but at the same time, Baha'u'llah says, this is all new. And Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi say, this is new. There's a new conceptual framework here. There's a new way of approaching things. It's using the same language. In many cases, seems to be using it in the same way. But we also understand that Baha'u'llah was a great spiritual pragmatist. He understood the condition of humanity. He understood its limitations, and he provided a remedy. And the remedy was not suddenly everyone drop everything and go and look at it in this totally different way. The remedy was a little bit more sweet and gradual than that. The remedy allows us to keep understanding things the way we might have in the past, and gradually guides us to understand things in a different way. It's a remedy that, as we'll see, particularly in day 4 when we talk about the mystical path, it's a remedy that acknowledges the validity of varying perspectives, including the older perspective, what I'll call the older traditional perspective, that sees God in the heavens and us here down on earth. While at the same time acknowledging the validity of other perspectives in which God now becomes something within, like completely the inverse of what we thought before. And it also it acknowledges the validity of other perspectives in which the idea of God as a being goes away in some vision of deeper oneness. in which the distinction between this and that is lifted entirely. So Baha'u'llah is not asking us to go back to modes of worship, patterns of thought, and false certainties of the past. He's not offering a turning back of the clock before this upheaval of the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. He's not restoring our sense of what godliness and piety was in the old sense of the word. He's not somehow imposing some universal dogma, and this is how unity is to be brought about. He's not imposing anything like what certain Muslims today would say, well, let's just impose Sharia law upon the world. After all, that's what the Quran says. He's not imposing some absolutist theocracy. Instead, he's acknowledging that none of us have direct contact with truth. That the ultimate ground of things is forever out of our reach. And therefore, all we have are models. All we have are the sacred narratives. But to call them stories is not to do them justice, because these are stories that have effect. These are narratives that transform and shape human existence. These are ways of thinking and being and believing which, although not making contact with ultimate reality perhaps, are aligning us in that direction. There's the image of the finger pointing at the moon. You know, the moon might as well be an infinite distance away from the finger. But he's like the finger that's pointing us in the right direction. We're not going to get there. We're never going to actually reach the surface of the moon, but we're going to be heading off in that direction. And we're going to be doing so by following the prescriptions of the divine physician who has his finger on the pulse, who prescribes the remedy. I've already mentioned these quotations. And we're going to be doing it by setting ourselves completely free of old patterns of thought, that all our attention may be focused upon these new principles, for these are the light of this time and the very spirit of this age. And he says, if we're asking, well, to what extent are these ideas counter Enlightenment, or are these further to and a fuller expression of the spirit of modernism? Abdu'l-Baha says this reformation and renewal of the fundamental reality of religion constitute the true and outworking spirit of modernism, the unmistakable light of the world, the manifest effulgence of the Word of God. The problem, as anyone who has read the Baha'i writings has noticed, the problem is that they are beautiful and uplifting and inspiring, but the pieces of this new way of thinking, the conceptual framework, are scattered throughout it, like a handful of pearls sort of cast into the thousands of pages of text. And nowhere do we have an essay or a treatise by Baha'u'llah or Abdu'l-Baha saying, this is the sort of from A to Z presentation of this new way of thinking. It has to be extracted from these writings. It has to be assembled. The pieces have to be gathered somehow and assembled. And that will be our task over the next few days, to look at one possible way of assembling them.